Decentralize all the things. Decentralize all the things.
Hey there! Welcome to the Web3 Summit Decentralize Now podcast series, hosted by the Decentralize All The Things podcast network. This series features discussions about decentralization from the 2018 Web3 Summit held in Berlin, Germany. This is episode 11. In this episode, we bring you a great conversation about open source and decentralized data sources and tools, and why they're critical to the decentralized future. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
The idea of this panel, obviously, if you have questions about somebody's thing, it's really cool to go for it and ask. But the real point of this panel, I'm curious about like the importance of this effort that you guys are making in general. Like, why is it so important to actually have decentralized access or open source block explorers and decentralized data? That's kind of the theme. So I'm hoping you guys can just have a nice conversation about it. Does anyone want to make a, yeah.
For me, it goes back to my original encounter with the Ethereum community, in particular with Griff when I first got involved. They were building the DAO smart contract. This was prior to its demise and all that. And the dream was that they were going to build a piece of software that 50,000 people could participate in, and because we could all see all of the data, we could all trust that the system was working exactly as it was, and then we could all participate in a way that you wouldn't really participate as a person. You wouldn't participate if you had to trust somebody. When I have to trust somebody, I don't know about you, I go a little bit like this, and I kind of back away a little bit, and I hold something back. But if you don't have to trust, you give completely because there's no pain. There's no potential loss to you. So that dream of writing software that allows you to not hold back was what I was all about from the very beginning. And for me, that means get the data directly from a node, because I know I can trust the node, and I know I can trust my software to get the data directly from the node. So that's kind of been my mission for 2 years, 2.5, 3 years.
Thanks. So I started with this about 2.5 years ago, and it's kind of a personal story. You know, I saw Etherscan and some of the other early block explorers, and I was just curious how they did it. How can you get all that information out? And well, then you start to program against these RPC calls, and you actually find out that it's not as straightforward as you might think. So I think my personal thesis is that you really start learning how a blockchain technology works by building a block explorer, because you get into all the nitty-gritty details. And what's good with these early block explorers is that it gives you something to compare your own results against. So it was quite a challenge, for example, to get these internal transactions. It's a name that was coined by Etherscan because it's not in the default clients. It's not there. So I think it is very important that there are alternatives for Etherscan with the complex and the advanced data sets they offer. Clearly, Etherscan is not open source, but more practically, there are also just assumptions that Etherscan will always be there, which is not something we can build on. So even if we're not going the full 9 yards with decentralizing everything, it would be good to have Etherscan type services which are not by Etherscan. So you have multiple alternatives to go through. And in the end, I think we all agree on the end game. For me, there's also lots of pragmatics, just get stuff out there that can actually help you to query. And we will get to that decentralized utopia sometime.
For us, it was simple. RPC. Like, I was working on other projects, and I kept on getting requests. Hey, we need more data, basically. And we need a large historical data set. Can you somehow put this in a relational database? I said, no. Okay. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, +1 for all guys. I think for sidechains, it's a question of existence. If you don't have a decent blockchain explorer, then you cannot compete with Ethereum. So for us, it was question. It was not a question to build it, but when we were focused on our protocol, we thought, okay, we can buy or borrow some other parts, right? But with Blockchain Explorer, it was not possible to get the same experience. And so second thing that I'm, like my experience with Etherscan, if you remember when recently Parity and Geth had a consensus bug on Ropsten network, Etherscan censored transaction on Ropsten. So basically, if you search for a transaction which contains exploit, Etherscan will not show it. Because someone asked them, okay, can you please remove this transaction before we fix Parity or Geth? And no one will hard fork the mainnet. Yeah, but well, you can get this transaction from a node, but they censored this transaction for our good, right? So, is it good or not? For me, it was not good. I'd rather be happy, if because of consensus bug, something will forked. And actually, Coven Network forked. Someone submitted transaction with the same. If you remember, it was a bug with EIP86. It forked Coven Network. It didn't fork mainnet, but Etherscan censored this transaction, and I thought, like, what the fuck, that was a turning point. I thought, yeah, we need to have a alternative where this will not be censored by centralized party. And now we hold this block scout, but anyone can launch their instance and get the same experience, and they can see how we build it and get the same experience. So that's my two biggest points. So now, because I'm the last here, what's any question from public? Yep.
I'll just for a second. Yeah, hi, I'm Ed. I actually work with Jay on TrueBlocks. Yeah, so what I've been thinking is I'm really curious to your guys' approach to verification of the data, because I know that in Jay's case, the user is scraping the chain. And so the verification comes with that because you're doing the work yourself. And so I want to know about what kind of ideas you guys are thinking for, is the user doing the scraping and thus it's like implicitly verified, or do you have some other strategy for verification? Where is the trust line drawn? And I'm also interested in Fluence's perspective on this as well.
I'll take it. So I was just talking with Jay about how large this design space for block explorers is, and there's the mammoth type database explorers, and then there is the very light type explorers that are very targeted in what you're looking for. And also with the classifications of information, I think verifiable data is a subset of all the information you can get. If you associate verified data with some other external source, then already it becomes something that you cannot verify, but you need to trust on to some extent. So I think in that design space, some explorers will pop up that really focus on that verifiability, and where you can, you should, of course. But then there is a very large design space which also focuses on all the other stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think that we want to be very specific about which parts of the data are verifiable and can't be censored, like Etherscan, and which parts are additional data brought in from a place that wasn't agreed to by the blockchain. So I look at the blockchain data, the stuff that's been consented to by 10,000 computers around the world, as really special data. It's very different data than almost any other data we've ever had in the history of the world, I might say. It's been agreed to in a way that we all agree is mathematically provably agreed to by 10,000 computers. And we have to be really careful about taking that data and mixing it with price data, as an example, in US dollars, or other data that comes from sources that is not directly from the node. And I want us all to keep that in mind as we go forward, because what happens, I think, is that as you start mixing these sources of data, application developers are going to start using both the agreed to data and this additional data, and then they're going to be locked in and they can't get out because that source of additional data is not part of a globally available consented to data stream, basically. So that, I think, is a really important thing to think about.
And if you guys, there's an open seat. If anyone wants to jump in and take a dive. Yeah, there we go.
Well, it's just on that topic, actually, of the mixing data. I'll jump off in 2 seconds. It's just a brief one. So, as Joe was saying, mixing price data, bad idea. And I was actually thinking about this during your talk on when you said that you were pulling the API and you could extend with others, which I thought was brilliant. But one of the things we have in the Block Explorer space is that we are pulling in price data, and that's based on tether balances. There's a thing called, what is it? It's fair price or something like that discounts the tether price and all kinds of other metrics. But how we're actually deriving our prices may not be a good metric, because say you delete tether, it goes bankrupt tomorrow. What happens to our ecosystem? And so yeah, I really want to commend you on just that thought.
Yeah, so that's a hard design questions when we have on-chain data and off-chain data. What should we have and what should not, right? And when we think about people who use blockchain explorers, we separate them into two categories, right? So one group is developers, and second group is basic token holders. We call them like contributors to projects. And token holders, they are not interested in seeing prices in way, right? And they're interested in seeing and in observing price, like historical data also. Like, okay, I had transaction, a few days ago. What was the price of Ethereum at that time, right? So they're interested in these features. And when we think about usability, it's always a compromise, right? You have to think, okay, what is important for your users? But we keep this configurable, so you can decide, okay, I don't want price feeds, and you just keep it empty, and you will have all data in native tokens. So second design decision, okay, there are some, like you can create an ERC20 contract with the name of, I don't know, Aragon, right? And you can scam other people theoretically, right, and send them a link to this token. And you can create supply distribution the same as Aragon, and you can say, okay, please buy something from this smart contract. On Etherscan, we have this ability of a centralized entity to put some flags, like scam, phishing, whatever. And on open source blockchain explorers, should we do this? Can we do this? And so forth, right? So now we think that we should have this type of model, like admin model, where admin of an open source blockchain explorer can flag some data and create this user generated content on top of blockchain data. And third thing is, which is also critical for some applications. Some applications rely on event data, and they get this data from APIs, right? Some, for example, if I see an event from this contract, then I, deduct some tokens from user account on application data. And we already see that some people started to use Black Scout API to get events from the network, and I think, wow, it's such a responsibility now, because someone can fake event data and break that for users, right? And show some information they don't expect to see, that's important. Like, how should we protect API endpoints, especially with events? And that's some consideration about data validity. When we think about source code of smart contracts is important, but this type of attacks are less likely happening, right? Because scammers and all this type of crypto criminals, they most of them are using simple attacks. Like, yeah, here's a phishing email from your favorite token. You have to transfer it, to another contract, right? Some simple type of attacks, and they can be prevented on blockchain explorer level. But if we think, all data should be like, we should take only on-chain data, only verifiable data, and so forth, then we will miss this opportunity of data verification for end users, and they will start to lose money. Right?
Yeah, I completely agree that you're going to want to enhance this data that's been agreed to by the entire world. I really want to not to have to agree to that. I want computers 8 years from now, 10 years from now, where all the computing is done on nodes and every application is written to a node so that every piece of data is completely verified. That's what I want. That's what I thought I bought into 3 years ago, naively, I suppose. But I'm really not interested in kind of compromising on that. So that's why I'm stuck down on a laptop writing code against a node, because I want to explore what it looks like and how far away are we from being in a place where every piece of data we use has been verified by 10,000 computers. So I want to keep that vision alive because I think that's really interesting. So I'm going to step on.
Yeah, and I think on that note, we can have DApp nodes going pretty soon where, because, especially when we start talking Polkadot and these really complicated clients, it's really hard to run it on a laptop. And with a DApp node, you can actually have a client running for you and your friends and family that trust you, so you don't have to trust Infura or whoever you're pinging, or Etherscan or whatever. You throw a block scout on it, you throw true blocks on it, and maybe you can have a Polkascan and different chains that are on that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question to DAppNode. Do you plan to host Black Scout instances so people can deploy them?
Already working on it. Absolutely. So excited about it. Are you kidding? Yeah.
Yeah, so this DAppNode idea is fantastic. I love it. I want to make a piece of hardware that has 256-bit registers in the hardware. And I tell people 310 terabyte hard drives, because I just want to run a DAppNode on that kind of computer someday. So if anybody's building that kind of computer, I will definitely buy one, depending on the price. And talking about price, I wonder how much, do you have an estimate for how much it would cost to run Block Scout on the Ethereum network if I installed it and ran it myself on, say, AWS or something like that?
Well, there are, it depends on your budget, right? So you can run the same software but with different assumptions. Yeah. For example, for us, it's our it's face of our network, Blockchain Explorer. So probably we overpay for some for scalability and for fault tolerance. So we host we have two full nodes, archive nodes, and load balancing for mainnet and auto scaling instances on AWS, which is expensive. Yeah, but I estimate with low traffic, it will be in cloud services. It will be like few grants per month for mainnet setup. It's I think few grants per month. So that's few. Well, sometimes it's easier to say few grants than not few $1,000s. Yeah, that's running Blockchain Explorer is an expensive thing to do, right?
Yeah, so we did a calculation on it a while back, but it's really, really expensive, and it goes really beyond that factor. Two factors determine cost. It's basically the storage of your database, and it's the amount of traffic you get from your website. And the storage is about 6-7 terabytes, maybe, if you take into account all your indexes on mainnet. If you drop the Shanghai attacks, then perhaps you can drop 2 or 3 terabytes even. Wow. So that's good. So if you skip block 2.0 28 million to 2.46 million, then you're good. That saves you half the price. And traffic is really something you cannot control. Etherscan, it's, I think, one of the ecosystem's most frequently visited sites. And yeah, so exactly. So, well, I wouldn't want to be getting that invoice for that. But that kind of is the reason why we have chosen so far not to pursue a mainnet explorer, or at least one of the alternatives to start right now. We've been discussing is to, for example, have a transient explorer to cover the last 1,000 or 2,000 blocks. Then you can really contain the cost. But that gets into another question: how do you finance a public block explorer? And I think that is a unaddressed or mostly unaddressed question. And who finances Etherscan, for example? But answering that question explains why there aren't many other explorers so far as well. So perhaps someone would like to comment on that, but that's one of the real challenges, in my opinion.
I mean, first, let me just say, if anyone has a question, there's a really comfortable seat right here. But for as far as funding, there are a lot of really cool grant programs out there. That's how Block Scout was made. It's a really nice fat chunk of money from ETHPrize. And there's so if anyone else is working on open source Block Explorer type infrastructure, yeah. TrueBlock got a Ethereum Foundation grant, Vulcanized DB, and we help other people at Giveth. We have a grant support campaign, so if you need help trying to get grants, we know the process pretty well and have applied successfully for many of them, and we can help people out. Also, there's always the innovative approach that Etherscan takes, which is who knows, what they're doing with your data. So I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of individual people out there that would be really excited to support a project like this because it protects their data. I'm excited to see some of the classic. I know ICOs have a bad name, but there are opportunities to do more creative approaches with token economics. And you don't necessarily need to require a token to be used on your platform to use a token to fund your platform. I'm really excited to see some of these curation markets where you create a token that's like an investment token that wants to make a change in the world. And then it has a token bonding curve where the price goes up as people buy in. But then a portion, whenever someone buys into that token bonding curve, some tokens are created in a fund that can support open source block explorers, for instance. And then anyone who buys these tokens can then stake them and delegate their stake to someone they trust to make decisions on what should be funded, or of course to make that decision themselves. There's going to be a lot of cool things going on.
Can I comment? Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, because it's I will not tell you numbers, right? But I just want to share some business model I am aware of. So one is like Infura model. So Infura, we were the first blockchain which purchased Infura service for PoE, right? And it's good for us because it supports decentralization of the network. For example, if PoE validators will break consensus, all incoming API requests are through Infura, and most likely Infura will not support this hard fork, not planned hard fork, right? So that was good for us. So this model. Usually there is like setup fee and monthly fee. The same model actually exists with Etherscan. We don't know prices, but we know that they sold at least one instance of Explorer for Energy Web Foundation. They're paying for it, so it can be a revenue stream. And we explore the same. We don't know numbers, but we explore the same revenue stream for Block Scout. Yeah, you can take this open source software for free, right? You can deploy it and support and then so forth. But if you don't want to have it, yeah, you can buy a hosted instance on blockscout.com, and first of all you get a hosted instance with SLA, but also you will have our traffic, right? Because more people will use this Explorer, they will see additional networks, and it will bring traffic. and also it will bring some credibility and support. It will support decentralization, because networks can say, you know what, we cannot manipulate data because it's hosted by someone else, and we have SLA agreement with this company, and they have all these other legal ways to not allow them to modify data. So it's good for decentralization of our small network. So that's model, and we don't think that we will sell data, and I don't think how can it be possible in this model, and we don't plan to do this or put ads, because putting ads on website like Etherscan is an indirect way of selling data, right, to advertisers, to Google, and authorities can ask Google, okay guys, please tell us all IP addresses who visited the smart contract from Google, not from. What Google Analytics is a bit different. In Google Analytics, you can say, okay, we want to hash, IP addresses and with some salt, and Google will not have this information. So with pixels, you can protect privacy of users. Well, it's obviously with analytics.
So I think it's good to differentiate between the funds you need to develop a piece of software, open source software or any other piece of software, and the operational cost of actually running a service such as a block explorer. So the first one has nothing to do with the other one. You can have the perfect open source software, but if it's too expensive to operate it, then no one will operate it. You can operate it yourself perhaps, but that would be expensive as well, perhaps cheaper than a public-facing website. So I think it's a real challenge to discuss how to fund the operational costs of block explorers. Well, for mainnet Ethereum, that is obviously very challenging, but the upside is perhaps that for consortium chains and all these, that multi-chain reality we're heading towards, what we are betting on basically, that there will many instances of blockchains with individual stakeholders or consortia which will be responsible for operating that type of blockchain, that these would be willing to outsource service management of running a block explorer type services for that. And I think both Block Scout and Web3 Scan are perfectly suited to anticipate that market.
And also cloud providers, big cloud providers, they have grants program to support open source software. So, for example, we received a grant from Microsoft for $200,000 in Azure credits, and it's not like through a website. So you have to find a person in Microsoft who is interested in supporting your open source software, but it's possible, and we spent like $100,000 in credits on hosting already, and now basically we're asking, can we make Black Scout better for Microsoft client, and you will support this credit line for our expenses? Because if we have credits from Azure, we'll be happy to deploy on Azure, and it will make a zero-sum game for us, right? At least for operation. So I think collaboration and partnerships is very important. And before cryptocurrencies, if you're an open source developer, you basically had two choices. One choice is to be poor and broken, and second choice is to be supported by corporation on a contract, basically working for corporation, right? Now we have this opportunity, to create token economy and sponsor open source projects ourselves. But before it was, much harder to be there. So now we have multiple streams, and token economy. When parties like for us, we have some resources from token sale and then our token, and we support Explorer for us. But we understand that new blockchain without ecosystem cannot exist.
So the idea of this panel, obviously, if you have questions about somebody's thing, it's really cool to go for it and ask. But the real point of this panel, I'm curious about like the importance of this effort that you guys are making in general. Like, why is it so important to actually have decentralized access or open source block explorers and decentralized data? That's kind of the theme.
So first of all, thanks for all these awesome explorers that you guys are making. So I think it's also very necessary. So thanks for that. now you're all sort of coming out with a product. If I would come out with such a product, I would also be sort of afraid about, or not afraid, maybe not the right word, but so you want to support like the right indexing, exposing the right data. I think already there is some discrepancy between data if you look at balances of tokens, for example, because you cannot index everything. So in your presentation, I believe like that you show discrepancies between what Etherscan shows and what your indexer actually shows. So and also looking at the presentation earlier from Gavin, if you look at the substrates, so for what I've understood from it, in a later stage it will be possible that you can really plug in new modules that modify state in whatever way that module is implemented in different languages, and so showing probably balances in whatever sort of tokens or assets that you can program in such a module. So I could expect that the complexity of maintaining an indexer will sort of exponentially grow. So what are your thoughts on that? And do you also include that into the sort of the operational costs? Because I think the costs now which were covered were more about like the network costs, the disk costs, and so forth. What are your thoughts on the maintenance costs?
So I think that is a real problem you are describing. That said, with Polkadot, it is in such an infancy stage at this point that it's really hard to say where it's exactly going to go. But what it looks like is that these runtimes will have metadata specified on-chain as well, which will provide you the semantics on how to decode the data which is on the chain by itself. So that scales really well by building a generalized interpreter for that. That said, I think our focus will be to co-create these explorers with the consortia or the chains that are going to launch in the Substrate and Polkadot ecosystem. So it doesn't actually have to mean that we are going to host these explorers, but it can be a service you provide on-premise for these consortia. For example, an energy consortium with their own developers, applying your software stack with the guidance and the consultancy that comes along with it on how to build your own Explorer instance for your particular network.
I think that's a really good question as well, that the more complex this situation becomes, and it will become way more complex, especially if there's sharding or something like that, or Polkadot is a good example. It may actually be impossible for a single explorer to index the entire planet. So we may have to just accept a world where we have 3,000 blockchains and 2,200 indexers or blockchain explorers or something like that. My work pushes me towards making the chains more accessible to extracting the data so that this isn't as complex as it feels. And I think Ethereum, one of the things they did was they dropped this Ethereum virtual machine into a blockchain without really thinking terribly deeply about how they were going to get that data back out. And that's why, for the Ethereum blockchain at least, it's so complicated. So as we go forward with new types of blockchains, we should really think carefully about how the explorers or the indexers or the extractors are going to get the data back out in a reasonable way, and push that capability into the node software, so the node software becomes easier to access.
Yeah, and perhaps one more thing. As long as you build a harvester or an indexer or a scanner that can keep up with what's happening in one single blockchain, then you can also delegate the scanning and the harvesting and the indexing, or distribute it over the number of stakeholders that each run their own type of blockchain. And that is a business model that scales very well if you go into a service management of that.
Yeah, but then of course you're assuming that the data of your peers is to be trusted, and I believe that you're another proponent of that, in the sense that I heard you say, if I'm not mistaken, that you want to run your own client because you can validate it yourself, and you exactly don't want to trust somebody else to actually provide that data.
I think my wife might point out that I have a little bit of trust issues, so that may or may not be true, but it sure feels to me that it's imperative that we keep very tight control on this issue of trust. And we don't mistakenly, I'm not saying that we would knowingly enter into systems that lose the trust, but it's easy to just fall into that because we make things more and more and more convenient for ourselves. And I think the trade-off, this same thing happened 25 years ago with the web in a much smaller way, but back then we were all talking about everybody running their own node. And it became too difficult, and we ended up where we are. And my concern is that if we're not careful, we may end up not only where we're at now, but in a place that's way worse because the data that we're creating is so deep and so intimate data that, and it's so valuable that we may be falling into a position that we're in now 30 years from now or something, and we're way worse off than we are because we're not careful about that issue of trust. So that's what
Yeah, sure. So basically what you're describing is the situation we had before, like, I don't know, a year ago, at least for us, right? We didn't have this Explorer, which we can modify for POA network. For example, in POA network, there are like known identities of validators, and we want to expose them into blocks in the UI, right? So we have to make some configurations. And now we host 6 networks and plan to host like 15 more. And actually those networks exist, and they're supported by different versions of Ethereum protocol, by different clients. And when we kind of try to index them, sometimes we can see something that we need to modify in our indexer. But this work is not that hard if you already have architecture which is suitable to index more networks. So I think it's not as big problem as we expect with a substrate type of blockchains, but each chain will need to be configured, right? Configuration of this network will take some power from some not power, but like you need to spend some time to do this, right? Someone needs to do this, and we are happy to do this. For example, for Ethereum compatible networks. Why? Because we can make some tweaks in indexer and get new chains, right? And people are excited that we can do this. And I don't think it's a big issue because we'll have multiple instances. So for Black Scout, which will index different chains, there are about 20 Ethereum compatible networks created since like 4 years ago. But also there are hundreds of private network and maybe thousands of, right? We don't know, like all this quorum type of networks, parity-based networks, and all these deployments. And these networks, like we don't see these networks and we don't know what's happening there. But with publicly available networks, I can say, yeah, there are some problems with indexing rootstock or Rinky-B, right? Because they have different consensus, and if you want to get validators from blocks, you have to modify indexer. There are some networks with instantly final blocks, like quorum type networks with or we will deploy Honeybadger BFT. It also will have instantly final blocks. So we will not have reorgs there, right? So we need to say, okay, if the network is using this consensus, most likely we will not see reorgs, right? Some modifications and tweaks. And yeah, I think it's possible to have indexer. Modify indexer is much less work than launch a new sidechain, blockchain, fork, because it takes more work to launch a blockchain than to modify indexer for it.
If I can just go a little further on that. So I think, so what I see is that there are sort of two types of let's say indexing. So one of the category of indexers might be data that's a lot of people actually need on a public blockchain. For example, let's say balances of ERC20 tokens. So I think a lot of attention has to go into that. So that's sort of a generic component in each of these explorers. But the fact that they're all open source and I can sort of roll my own or build further on the work that you've already created would be very easy for me, even in a situation like Substrate and all that's new technology that's coming on. That I roll my own type of extra indexer that goes specifically and goes very deep into the analysis of whatever logic or state transitions that I introduce into that chain. And that might be something optimal for me. So maybe that's like the first category might be something that you guys stay focused on. And then like there could be like a whole community of people that just contributes. So if they introduce new like states changing modules, that they also provide sort of plugins based on the system.
That's what we hope for.
Yeah, okay, let's hope together then.
Hi, Bok here. I was just wondering about how you get data for the source code for programs that have been deposited with Etherscan, and how do you get it into your blockchain explorer? And there's probably going to be a need for an automated tool to suck the data. So I think Etherscan seems to be quite open to their source code being sucked out. And then, should there be another repository somewhere where the source code is stored?
So for Etherscan, so source code is stored on Swarm, right? So you can get it from there. Well, you can extract source code from Etherscan and import it to another blockchain explorer. But I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand from their privacy policy and terms of usage, it's not legal to scrap their website, get smart contracts. But recently they introduced API for smart contracts, so we can get this data. So yeah, that will be a great idea that you can export smart contracts, verified smart contracts, put them. We plan this. If you run an instance of Black Scout, you specify S3 bucket, and every, for example, day, all smart contracts will be offloaded, all this data, and they can be imported to other instances. But someone should set up this import of verified. And when you import data, the instance of Black Scout will verify again and check it and then put data within. But yeah, that's very important because right now Etherscan is a GitHub, right? And GitHub was acquired by Microsoft, right? So we can have Microsoft, which will own. It's not bad, right? It's just very. It's not because they will not shut down Etherscan, right? But it means that all data will be available to authorities, and they can change this data and policies whenever they want, right?
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you are aware that, but there is an open source Block Explorer Telegram channel, and this is actually one of the topics that we discussed at length a few months back, I believe. And the fact that this huge repository of contract sources and contract APIs sits on Etherscan is a choke point and a single point of failure in the ecosystem. So
in a sense, you might want the other block explorers to be able to suck the source code and share it among themselves.
Yes, well, that would be an immediate relief of getting rid of that choke point. But then there is the problem that contract sources are verified on Etherscan. So how do you make sure that these contract sources are also verified on the other explorers? So ideally, you would want some sort of decentralized repository for contract sources and APIs with the verification step that the compiled bytecode matches the bytecode matches the compiled source, and apparently that's quite difficult, and you would need some sort of Golem or IXSec type on-chain or TrueBit on-chain type solution to actually build that sort of stuff. That was my takeaway from that discussion.
One thing I would say about that is that once a single instance of an address associated with source code, associated with a verification of the source code is completed, it's completed for all time. You don't have to do it a second time. And you can convert that sort of whole history of all that activity into an IPFS hash and put it in an IPFS hash. And now for the rest of time, as long as it's stored, that's available.
But it would push the problem forwards because you would still have some sort of reputation or claim that you can trust the production of that information.
One of the reasons why I changed the name from QuickBlocks to TrueBlocks is because I'm trying to figure out a way to store enough information in the file that becomes the hash so that anyone can re-verify given just the information in the hash. It's sort of, I think of it like a scientific venture where you would produce all the data so that all the other scientists can reproduce the data they have everything they need to reproduce the data. So, I hear you that it pushes it out a little bit, but you can push it out in a way that makes it more easy to verify in the future.
Yeah. So one very practical problem you run into is that it's very hard to get the old, ancient compiler versions, the first versions of Solidity. It's almost you're unable to reproduce these compiler versions, and these smart contracts have been deployed with these old compilers. So how can you verify these old smart contracts? It's a very, very hard problem.
Is it my understanding that it's not trivial to, if the deployed bytecode, I can't just reverse engineer it? Is that the crux of the problem? And is it because of the way that Solidity is written, or is the fact that you're just not trivial to reverse engineer these deployed bytecode?
There are some decompilers, and they work pretty well, but you lose all sorts of labels and containers, and it's very hard to really make sense of what you get if you run the bytecode through such a decompiler. So there are quite some advanced tools to decompile and to spot for certain patterns that have vulnerabilities. I don't know them by name, but there are a number of them. But in general, it's very hard to make some sense of what you decompile.
Yeah, and also when you think about this, you think about Solidity, right? But there are other languages, at least Viper and WebAssembly, and with WebAssembly it will be different. The same problem, actually, I remember there's the same problem with iOS development when I used to work with mobile devices. Like there was a decompiler for Objective-C bytecode, right? But not for Swift. So Swift programs were more secure because it was much harder to decompile them. And that's why some companies migrated to Swift, because it was easier to, at least for some time, right, to get code hidden from reverse engineers. But the basic problem here that you cannot deterministically decompile to the same code.
And my understanding is that the current mechanism, the incentive for, like when I deploy a contract on and I verify it on Etherscan, it's because I am the contract owner, and then the incentive is that I want other people to use my code, and that's why I verify it.
Yeah, it's. I think this common practice started with ICOs, right? When you create an ICO, you have two contracts: crowd sale contract and token contract, right? For participants, it's interesting to understand terms which you described off-chain are the same that embedded into on-chain smart contract, and that what you pay, that what you get, right? So that's very important for ICO projects to publish their code. Also, there is something called code audit, right, for smart contracts. And when the auditor audited your code and you deploy this code, it's good to match the same code. So your users can be sure that the code deployed on chain is the same that was audited, so it's secure, and they can invest their money. So that's how verification of smart contracts became mainstream, I think, from ICO, right?
And one of the bonuses is if you compile the source code, you have the source code, and you will get the ABI for free. And that's the application binary interface, which actually states how to interact with the smart contract and get some of the semantics out of the data you store in the contract. So not having the contract source means that you don't have the API, and means, it's really difficult to interact with the smart contract. So, anyone else? Yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give us a rating or comment if you enjoyed this content. This episode was brought to you by Santa and the unicorns at giveth.io. Remember, this podcast is made possible by the donations we receive from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by donating Ether at dattpodcast.com. That's DATT podcast.com. Please check the show notes for more information. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep decentralizing all the things.